So about 6 months ago in the Cleric Reveal video, Jeremy Crawford said this.
People will notice that not just in Preserve Life, but many places in the player's handbook where before certain healing effects didn't work on undead and constructs, that has largely been removed. And instead, when the Monster Manual comes out, people will find that certain monsters, particularly monsters that are made of like shadow stuff from the negative energy plane, we are exploring it being a feature of the monster themselves. It isn't even that they can't be healed, it's that they're actually harmed by healing spells.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
And so that actually is allowing us to bring back some flavor that has existed in earlier editions of healers being able to turn their healing spells on certain kind of fell creatures. But for that, people will have to wait for the new Monster Manual.
That's awesome, though. That's a great change.
Well, we now have the new Monster Manual, and in case you were curious, this is not a thing. The notion that constructs or fiends or undead, even a very limited amount, would end up being not just not healable through magic, but actively harmed by it did not come to fruition. We'll talk a bit more about this later, but it did get me thinking about some more of the good and the bad as far as the updated monster designs go in the new book, so that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. The hits and misses of the new 2024 Monster Manual. You see what I did there? We've got 3 for each, so for a total of 6 to get through. So we're going to start with the hits, the things I feel that they did really well, and then we're going to move on to some of the misses. A quick shout out to all of my patrons and channel members. You guys rock. I can't thank you enough for the support. And there's still 2 spots left currently in the Elderbrain patron tier if you are interested in playing in a monthly game with me as your DM. But if you don't want to, that's totally fine. Just watching these videos, subscribing, liking, sharing, it all goes so far to helping me grow and costs nothing. Thank you so much. Success number 1. Monsters are dealing more damage and feeling distinctly more threatening. I'll give them credit for this, as it was one of their stated design goals, and you'd be lying to yourself if you looked at the new monsters and said that they weren't significantly more deadly than their 2014 counterparts were. I made an entire series going over all of the deadliest creatures by challenge rating if you want to see what I'm talking about. I'll leave it linked in the end. Honestly, I think this is a very good thing, and no, I'm not just saying that because I think it's fun to kill your party, but because I think it's important for the game to feel consistently challenging to players at different tiers of play. Most player options in 2014 would just wipe the floor with many of the monsters of the same era. I will say that yes, as a general trend, it was true that as the years went on and we got closer and closer to 2024, some newer monsters tended towards a higher power level, but it was far from consistent. And then as we saw the release of the 2024 Player's Handbook, and we saw these significant power jumps for most classes on average, a lot of us began to wonder how this was going to be handled on the monster side of things, especially as there were like 5 months between the new PHB and the new Monster Manual. So yeah, monsters are by and large much more deadly, but that kind of manifests itself in a few ways in this book. One way I think is great, and another I know that most people are a little bit more mixed on. What I think is the definitely good way, and I'm totally here for, is just the sheer outright aggression and damage output that we're seeing. Like I already mentioned, this has gone up. In many cases, it's gone way up. Many creatures are simply dealing more average damage than they ever used to deal, but it's also worth noting that there is far less variance within a given challenge rating than there used to be as well. There's obviously still going to be some differences, and that's fine, because some creatures are just designed and intended to be ruthless party killers, whereas others might have some more subtle designs and maybe cripple a group through status conditions and let one of their allies finish you off. This is an inherently difficult thing to balance between creatures that deal damage and creatures that inhibit you or your party in some way, and it's especially difficult to do that within the same CR. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that they got everything perfect, nothing ever is, but I will say that it is worlds better than it was in 2014, and that is a massive step forward. The other way that this thing manifests itself is actually something that I've also made an entire video about: the prevalence of on-hit no-save effects. Since I did already make an entire video about this, like I said, I'm not going to dive into it too deeply here. Essentially, there are some status conditions that are being automatically applied when a monster hits a character and does not require any additional saving throw to be made. Things like the new Lich's Paralyzing Touch, which if it hits the target, in addition to taking damage, they become automatically paralyzed. These kinds of effects can be incredibly potent and can certainly be frustrating for some. I went into much greater depth on this in the video, so I'll also leave that linked in the end cards if you are curious. The thing is though, regardless of whether or not you liked those effects, they are powerful and threatening and can be intimidating to have to deal with. Given that the stated design goal of the book was to make creatures actually feel their challenge rating, this is one way that they have accomplished that, like it or not. Okay, success number 2. The removal of resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. This is something that had been speculated about for so long leading up to the release of the new Monster Manual. Honestly, probably at least as far back as the first 2024 Unearthed Arcana, and we finally know that they did get rid of it entirely. To be clear, resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage does still remain in the game, but it is nowhere near as prevalent as it once was. To get some stats on it, the new 2024 Monster Manual has a total of 503 creatures in it. A grand total of 31 of them have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, which is a total of 6% of the monsters in the entire book. This feels like a completely fair and reasonable amount of creatures to have a resistance to a thing. The 2014 Monster Manual, on the other hand, take a guess and boost the engagement on this video a little bit and comment how many monsters of the 496 you think in it had resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. I'll give you a second. The crazy thing is that I'm not even sure if this is surprising or not. There were 127 monsters in the old Monster Manual with some variation of resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. That's about 25% of the book. That does not feel like a fair and reasonable amount of monsters to have resistance to a certain thing. And that was exactly the problem, and is precisely part of the reason why martial characters could also feel less impactful in certain instances. When there's always a very good chance that the enemy that you're coming up against is just going to be cutting your damage in half, it's not a great feeling. It functionally made magic items almost mandatory in a lot of ways, which can also accelerate or alter the intended power curve of the game or that specific table. There were a lot of more subtle and knock-on effects of this design, and I am so happy that it's gone. With it out of the way, and with resistance now applying to all forms of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, this means that it now also encompasses those damage types from spells. Yes, I know flat-out resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing also did exist, but it was so rarely used. And make no mistake, there are plenty of spells that deal those kinds of damage too. Grasping Vine, Ice Knife, Ice Storm, Hail of Thorns, Conjure Animals, and Cloud of Daggers, just to name a few. I'm certainly not going to say that this levels the playing field, but it goes a long way to balancing out the damage resistance disparity. And I know some people are going to say, well, there's tons of creatures with resistance to poison and fire, and that is true, but generally speaking at least, most spellcasters will have significantly more variety of damage types that they can choose from with their spells, whereas martials, they don't. And to add insult to injury, 25% of the monsters were just resistant to basically all damage that early level martials would deal. Just imagine if 25% of the monsters in the game had resistance to all forms of alternate or elemental damage. That would be wild. And our third and final hit, on a related note, we're seeing more elemental damage throughout. This is maybe more of a subtle one that might not seem like a big deal, but again, it goes a long way to increasing the threat level of monsters and adding depth not just to encounters, but to player characters as well, which helps to make monsters feel like they're more than just bags of hit points. Elemental damage is much more pervasive throughout the new book. Even in the low challenge ratings, we're seeing it used more. Monsters like the CR-1/4 Aarakocra Skirmisher dealing thunder damage, the Bullywug Warrior dealing poison damage, and the Grimlock dealing psychic damage. What this does is truly sell from very early levels that damage types are important. Having resistance matters, and that attacks shouldn't always be a simple check of what uses the biggest dice. I want to be clear that I am not saying that elemental damage types are some novel part of 2024 monster design. It's just a slight but impactful tweaking of it. A lot of baddies that just didn't deal alternate damage types before now do. The 2014 Grimlock used to deal both bludgeoning and piercing damage with an attack. It now deals bludgeoning and psychic damage. This is important because not only will some of it now bypass something like a barbarian's rage, making them more aware of different types of threats, but it's also going to make players consider their choices in more rounded ways, especially with so many damage types being split, where an attack will deal some portion of one type and another portion of a different one. It makes it more likely that at least some part of those hits are going to be felt, which also speaks to the ideas of enemies being more threatening now. Before we go on to the misses, the underlying thread here with the hits is that they are all working together to let players have a little bit less tunnel vision. Creatures automatically applying status conditions, not just always being resistant to your attacks, and dealing a wide variety of damage types, all in their own ways elevate the combat experience to one where players will probably need to be a bit more cautious or calculated. Some of these might accomplish that goal in ways that we aren't necessarily all fans of, but hey, here we are. Okay, miss number 1. The Bloodied condition is massively underutilized. The Bloodied condition, or status, was reintroduced to 5th edition with the 2024 Player's Handbook. It was something that had existed in D&D in the past, but was nowhere to be seen in 5e prior to the new PHB. The status, or condition itself, doesn't do anything. It's merely there to signify that a creature has half of its hit points or fewer remaining. And that might not sound important or significant, and to be clear, it doesn't need to be. But the fact that they felt the need to bring the term back and codify it back into the book after being gone for so long suggested that they planned to use it for something. Now, in fairness, both the Life Cleric and the Champion Fighter make very minor references to the Bloodied status, so they did at least use it in the Player's Handbook. But I really don't believe that I was alone in thinking that the team was planning to use it much more extensively in the new Monster Manual, because there are so many things that you can do with it. I do want to be clear that overdoing it would also not be great. We don't need 2/3 of the creatures having some trigger when they become bloodied, but a few more than we got would have been nice. There are a grand total of 18 creatures in the new Monster Manual that mention bloodied at all, and just to be clear, they are far from diverse. 5 of them are swarms, which all triggered in the same way. 4 of them are gnolls, which just all get the same rampage feature. So if you're keeping score, that's 9 of our total 18, with only 2 unique ways to use the feature. And it's more or less the same thing as you go through it. 2 different kinds of golems have it, both berserkers have it, the quaggoths do, and so on. Despite having 18 creatures referencing bloodied, it only has 7 unique uses. That's out of a total of 503 monsters. With only 18 of 503 having it, we're only looking at like 3% of creatures making any use of the bloodied condition at all. Now, like I said, I don't think it's something we need on all, or honestly probably not even on most creatures, but I think we could have done a little bit better than 18. Things like bloodied go a long way to adding additional dimensionality to a fight, because it doesn't just have to be something that makes the creature worse once they're at half, though it could be. Maybe a vulnerability kicks in at that point, or maybe in its rage it gets access to a new legendary action, or additional speed, or maybe a reckless attack-like feature. There's so much more design space to explore here, and I sincerely hope that they take advantage of it in future releases. Miss number 2 is what we led off the video with: alternate methods of damage. I made it a little bit more broad here, but the concept is the same. When Jeremy Crawford mentioned that they would be returning the concept of reversible healing magic, able to damage constructs or some kind of fiends, I know that I was pretty excited about it. It's possible or even probable that they cut this for some balance reasons, and in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal. It's the kind of thing that would matter most in some fairly niche scenario where you're fighting a construct and happen to be a character which is particularly heavy on healing spells and don't have a whole lot of direct damage. And I mean, that happens. I had a Life Cleric in my last campaign that, for obvious reasons, went pretty hard on healing magic, and I think it would just have been pretty cool to be able to reward those players with some additional uses for those spells. It wouldn't even have had to have been every healing spell. Some could have been designated as reversible, but obviously that would have also required an additional trait in the stat block to explain what happens when healing magic is applied to them, and would have subsequently required some additional balance testing. It probably also would have meant that the other defenses on those monsters would have had to increase to compensate for the potential to be damaged in this way, which could have made them too strong. There's plenty of logical reasons for why they didn't do it, but none of them seem insurmountable. It is worth noting, though, that some constructs, like the Clay Golem for example, are actually healed by damage. Acid damage in the case of the Clay Golem. This is not new to 2024 and was also the case in 2014, but it shows that they've been at least experimenting with these concepts for some time in 5e. I just wish they went harder with it. And finally, miss number 3 is the lack of creative vulnerabilities. Before the new Monster Manual came out, something I spoke about a lot was wanting to see the use cases for vulnerabilities expanded on. Mainly because just so few creatures even have them to begin with. The 2024 book only contains 22 creatures that have any sort of vulnerability to begin with. That's incredibly low, it's like 4%. The thing with vulnerabilities though, is that you do need to be extremely careful with them. Again, kind of like Bloodied, we aren't looking to trivialize a fight. Instead, we're looking for ways to make the fight more interesting and rewarding for players for learning things during it, or for picking certain types of attacks. What's worrisome about having too many vulnerabilities is that it can lead to a situation where maximizing damage output is just insanely easy and does end up trivializing the fight, like I mentioned. And this could even happen by accident, to be clear. So I get why they didn't include a ton of creatures with vulnerabilities, but I should specify that when I am speaking about vulnerabilities here, I'm not exclusively talking about the double damage variety. I guess what I'm thinking about more is in the vein of damage weaknesses. Things like the Troll, which have a regeneration feature that just doesn't work if it takes acid or fire damage during the round. This is some version of a damage weakness. It provides a reward for players for learning something without resulting in everything being twice as effective. Another great example of this is kind of the opposite, but it's also related. The Frost Salamander from Monsters of the Multiverse does have a vulnerability to fire damage, so it is taking double damage from it. However, when it does, it also makes it so that its freezing breath, which typically only recharges on a 6, automatically comes back. This is another fun and creative way to explore damage vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and I really wish that we had seen more of it. A few creatures have these kinds of things, but they are very few and very far between. Shout out to the Rakshasa though for having an insanely specific vulnerability of piercing damage from weapons wielded by creatures under the effect of the Bless spell. You'll love to see it. Ultimately, everything we're talking about here, whether the hits or the misses, all feed into the same thing: dimensionality and depth. The hits are the things that can help make the creatures feel less like bags of hit points, and the misses are the things that if they were expanded on, would make creatures feel like less of bags of hit points. Monsters that react differently to certain things and respond in unpredictable and satisfying ways. These are just some of the small things that can help the game and encounters to feel more dynamic and interesting. So let me know what you think and what your hits and misses of the new book are. I am very curious to read what you guys all have to say. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.